Chapter 22, Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from giant country over the years. But he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head. He had never before travelled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. And as he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood, gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. And there are all the helicopters here. Can you see? And there's the BFG down there, running. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's red ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marvelled at the giant's speeds and at the way he leaped across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. Be careful to hang on tight. We's going as fast as a fizzle crump. And the BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forwards as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground, as usual. Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. And the 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realised they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Oh, where the devil are we going?" he cried. I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache, and he was very proud of his bushy moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. It's fun going to new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "Well, this place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" The pilot grinned. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page." "I expect that old giant knows where he's going," the young pilot said. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force, and he was shaking with fear, and in the seat beside him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone straight off the atlas?" he cried. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the pages, and as in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" the head of the army said, and the young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages on the back of an atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert. All the trees are dead and the rocks are blue." The giant stopped. He's waving us down. The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down to the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giants is all over there out of sight. But if you is taking those slosh-buckling, noisy bell-poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." So you want us to proceed by jeep? Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. And suddenly the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone, and the head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns," he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here." "Oh, pig's whiffle. Those noises is not guns." Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the army. "I'm a military man and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back." "Those is just giants snorkeling in their sleep. I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one." "Are you quite sure?" said the army man. And they all moved on, and then they saw them, even at a distance. They were enough to scare the daylights out of all the soldiers. But when they got close and saw the giants, what they were really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised his hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army. "If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say jackknife. Me is the only one what won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the army, several paces to the rear, and the head of the Air Force, climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, men," the head of the army whispered. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." And the soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains, and all of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie, now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. And to give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body, and it was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy black eyes.
"Which of you foul pesters is wriggling my arm? Is that you rotsome man-hugger?"
Suddenly he saw the soldiers, and in a flash he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers, and with a roar he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them, and the head of the army put his jeep into reverse.
"Human beings!"
The flesh lump eater yelled.
"What is you all flush-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?"
He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of BFG's hands, was watching horror-struck. "Do something," she cried, "quick before he eats them." "Put that human down," the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG.
"What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets?" he bellowed. You is making me feel very suspicious.
The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54 feet high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. And at the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something, she must. And she remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly she undid it.
"Eyes guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hands. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me, because I is galloping 50 times faster than you."
Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers, and when she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. And there she is. There you go. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You is bitten by a snake. I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome, powsome viper. It was a dreadly, dangerous, wind-screen viper."
"Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sounds the crumpets! I has been bitten by a sectitious, venomous, windscreen viper." He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking into me. I was feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet. The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise you is deader than a duck soup. I's helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands. That will stop the pals now's juices from the venison viper going up your leg and into your heart." And the flesh lump eater grabbed his ankles with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venison viper." The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signalled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tightly. "Do it quickly, before he is pizened to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." And when the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Oh, well done you," Sophie cried. And look, there he is, all trussed up like a turkey. There we go. "Well done you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the Queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle, and the flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the 8 other snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. "When you is only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The head of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" "Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up all my bottles of dreams." "We can't waste our time with that rubbish." It's the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. And while the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. And when they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. And when he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now he is driving back to the berry poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." And the jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. The finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. "Eyes flash-bunkled," roared the flesh lump eater. "Eyes spits wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "Eyes skog swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "Eyes goose grunched," howled the man hugger. "Eyes gungle swiped," shouted the meat dripper. "Eyes flug gungled," screamed the maid masher. "Eyes slop gruggled," squawked the gizzard gulper. And there they are, all trussed up, dangling by rope from the helicopters. "Eyes crod squinkled," yelled the blood bottler, and "I is mob muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel horses with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter, and the BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and one other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle. Those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath. The giant themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. And when it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giants so as to see him in their sights. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. What happens next? Woo!